think of a national identity, like any national identity, really there's usually this specific architect that just immediately springs to mind, you know?
Oh, absolutely. It's like a cultural shorthand.
Right. It's the shorthand we use to understand a whole society. And when you think of the classic foundational Israeli identity, you almost instantly conjure up the image of the Sabra.
Classic Sabra, yeah.
Yeah, the tough, prickly desert cactus on the outside, but sweet and soft on the inside. You picture this invincible, sun-baked pioneer.
Sleeves rolled up, work in the land.
Exactly. Gripping a rifle in one hand and a plow in the other, and just completely unbothered by the ghosts of the past. It's a really powerful, deeply ingrained image of resilience.
It is. It's all about forward momentum.
But what happens if you actually take a magnifying glass to that image? What if that famous tough-as-nails identity isn't just some organic evolution of a people returning to their homeland, but actually a very carefully constructed suit of armor?
A desperately constructed one, even.
Right. And what if you peel back the layers of that armor only to find it was built directly over this foundation of profound, inherited, intergenerational trauma?
Which is arguably one of the most compelling psychological paradoxes of the 20th century. I mean, we are looking at a society that actively built its entire modern identity on being the new Hebrew.
The ultimate strongman.
Exactly. A figure defined by being strong, proactive, physically rooted in the land, fiercely forward-looking. Yet at the exact same time, this very same society was carrying the absolute heaviest, most devastating psychological baggage imaginable.
The tension there is just, it's massive.
The tension between the myth of the invincible pioneer and the reality of the traumatized refugee created this massive sociological fault line.
And we are taking a deep dive into that exact fault line today. We're going to explore how an entire generation navigated the space between the heroic myths they were taught in school and the silent, heavy trauma they absorbed at the dinner table.
It's a heavy topic, but it's fascinating.
It really is. We have this incredibly layered educational and academic document in front of us today, originally created for the Israeli Ministry of Education. And just to set the record straight right off the bat for you listening, this isn't just a dry list of historical events.
No, not in the slightest. The author of this research is E.T. Moore, a researcher from the University of Haifa. And to really grasp the nuance of this text, we have to look at his specific lens.
Because his background is so crucial here.
It changes everything. Maurer's voice carries immense weight because he isn't just some academic observing this from a sterile university library. He is a third-generation Holocaust survivor himself.
Wow, okay.
He's also a cinema teacher. And perhaps most importantly for this research, he's someone who has traveled extensively to Poland.
Both officially and privately, right?
Exactly. On official, state-sponsored educational delegations for the State of Israel and on highly private personal journeys, he embodies the exact intersection of private memory, collective history, and cinema that we're about to analyze.
So he brings the academic rigor, the artistic eye of a film scholar, and deeply personal emotional stakes.
He really does.
So our mission for this deep dive is to follow his architectural blueprint of the Israeli psyche. We're going to unpack how the trauma of the second generation fundamentally shapes Israeli identity.
And we'll trace that evolution through the camera lens.
Right, specifically contrasting two landmark Israeli films. And we want to understand how the physical journey back to Europe, back to the literal soil of the trauma, serves as this profound catalyst for dismantling that old Sabra armor.
The document actually starts with a really crucial recalibration. Before we can even analyze the trauma, Mayer forces us to redefine what we actually mean by the term second generation.
Because the instinct is to just treat it like a simple biological timeline, right? Like a demographic bracket.
A date on a calendar, yeah.
You assume it just means people born between year X and year Y whose parents survived the war. But Mayer argues it's much more atmospheric than a birth certificate.
He expands it way beyond biology. Obviously, it includes anyone whose parents lived under Nazi occupation. But crucially, he says this generation encompasses anyone who grew up in a home that was shadowed by the Holocaust.
Shadowed? That is a really intense way to put it.
It is. Think about the properties of a shadow.
You can't touch it. It has no mass.
Right. But it completely dictates the light in a room. It alters the temperature. Mayer points out that this shadow manifested in very distinct, often polar opposite ways.
Right. The text mentions it was either haunting, graphic stories constantly being told, or this crushing, heavy silence.
Exactly. And the mechanism of transmission is what's vital here. Even if a child never experienced the trauma directly, say they were born in a sunny, vibrant new neighborhood in Tel Aviv, thousands of miles from the ash of Europe, The trauma is still irrevocably inherited.
They just absorb the anxiety from their parents.
They absorb the hypervigilance, the grief, through everyday behaviors. It shapes their foundational psychological architecture. And to understand how these individuals confront this, Mayer introduces the central concept of the journey.
And in this context, the physical trip back to Poland or Germany is never just tourism.
Never. It is mapped out on 3 distinct, heavily loaded conceptual levels.
The breakdown of these 3 levels really clarifies why this specific trip is so overwhelming. Like, the first level is the family home.
The intimate, deeply private sphere.
Right. The traveler is trying to physically stand in the literal domestic space where their parents came from, the living room they sat in before their world was destroyed.
And moving outward, the second level is the community cemetery. This represents the lost communal life.
So mourning the destroyed towns and synagogues.
Exactly. The broader cultural network that was completely erased. The traveler is standing there trying to process a massive void.
And then the third level pulls back even further to the national symbol, understanding the Holocaust as a foundational pillar of modern Jewish and Israeli national identity.
So put yourself in the shoes of that traveler. You step off a bus in Warsaw, and you're simultaneously trying to navigate a private family tragedy, a massive communal erasure, and the heavy ideological weight of a national narrative.
You're carrying all 3 in your backpack at the exact same time. That requires immense psychological fuel.
It does. Which leads to Mayer's fundamental question. What actually drives the person to subject themselves to that emotional burden? Why buy the plane ticket?
Right, why go?
He introduces a concept called the point of lack, or in Hebrew, nekudat chaser.
This concept totally shifts how you view trauma. We usually think of motivation as wanting to gain something.
But the point of lack is the exact opposite.
It's energy generated by a void. The best analogy I can think of for this is a phantom limb.
Oh, that's a brilliant way to frame it.
Yeah, we know amputees frequently feel intense pain or itching in an arm or leg that isn't physically there anymore. You can look at the space and see it's empty. But the psychological ache of its absence completely dictates how they move through the world.
It drives their reality.
For the second generation, the point of lack is a phantom limb in the family tree. The physical journey to Europe is essentially an agonizing attempt to reach out and touch that phantom limb.
And that analogy highlights the friction between the physical and the psychological. The traveler is executing physical actions, booking a hotel, walking down a street. But those actions are just a catalyst for deep mental movement.
They're actively seeking something that ceased to exist decades ago.
But the text is very careful not to frame this point of lack as a purely destructive force. It's not just a black hole.
That's a vital distinction. It's not inherently a trigger for endless mourning.
Right. Mayer notes that confronting this void can actually be the genesis for a brand new stance on life. The stark realization of the absence can forge an entirely new, deeply authentic identity.
It breaks down the inherited anxieties and forces a rebuild. But to really grasp why this point of lack was so powerful, we have to look at the specific environment these kids grew up in.
The conflict between the dinner table and the streets.
Exactly. The profound clash between private memory and collective memory. This is the crucible where modern Israeli identity was formed.
Think about the historical setting. You have the state of Israel barely on its feet, fighting for its literal survival on all borders.
And pouring into this fledgling state are hundreds of thousands of survivors carrying unspeakable trauma.
How does brand new nation absorb that? The stark reality is they simply couldn't absorb it on an individual level.
It was too much.
Way too much. The Holocaust was initially viewed as something too big for life to be digested by a society focused entirely on survival, so the collective memory framed it through massive, overarching national narratives.
The state was basically saying, we'll build grand monuments, we'll hold remembrance days, but society just didn't have the emotional bandwidth for the messy, agonizing trauma of the guy living next door.
And the text highlights a deeply unsettling sociological phenomenon from that era. Many native-born Israelis, those Sabras, genuinely felt the Holocaust was something that happened to other people in faraway places.
Which is cognitively wild. Those other people weren't strangers. They were their parents, their neighbors.
But the collective memory needed to keep the trauma at arm's length. And looking at it impartially, we have to understand the utilitarian necessity of that distancing.
The nation needed strong pioneers.
They desperately needed farmers and soldiers. The collective national myth of the New Hebrew simply didn't have room for the identity of the passive victim.
So they severed the public narrative from the private trauma out of perceived necessity.
For national cohesion and morale, yes.
That explains the street level. But let's open the front door and go inside the living room of a second-generation family. What was the domestic reality for those kids?
Mayer's analysis says it was an environment saturated with hypersensitivity, unspoken grief, and profound anxiety. But it manifested in two opposing extremes.
Right. On one side, you had the conspiracy of silence.
Think about what it takes to maintain absolute silence about the defining event of your parents' lives.
The trauma acts like a black hole, pulling all the conversation into it. Kids are perceptive. They learned very quickly not to ask questions about the numbers on their parents' arms.
Because asking a simple question caused visible pain. So the children became complicit in the silence to protect everyone.
But the silence became this heavy, paralyzing presence. And then on the total opposite end of the spectrum, you had homes characterized by an overdose of stories.
In those households, the trauma was inescapable, relentlessly verbalized.
Parents sharing highly graphic details with very young kids, constant warnings that safety is an illusion. Those kids were suffocated by the sheer volume of unfiltered trauma.
So you have a generation of kids trapped in paralyzing silence or overwhelmed by terrifying graphic trauma inside the house.
And then they walk out the door, go to school, and sing songs about being invincible pioneers.
The cognitive dissonance is staggering. The pressure of inhabiting both realities is enough to break a person.
But the research presents a fascinating pivot when we look at the third generation, the grandchildren. The dynamic fundamentally shifts.
It does. The findings show the third generation actually developed incredibly strong, warm, and highly inquisitive connections with their survivor grandparents.
They bypassed the anxiety that plagued their parents. They actively sought out the exact stories the second generation either hid from or were suffocated by.
But we have to ask why. Why does the act of trauma skip a beat like that?
Right. Why are the kids paralyzed, but the grandkids are sitting on the couch saying, "Grandpa, tell me about the war"?
The buffer is emotional safety that comes with generational distance. The second generation was raised by individuals who were actively presently triggered.
Raw trauma responses while raising toddlers.
Exactly.
Hmm.
But by the time the third gen is born, the survivors have aged, built established lives, and found some psychological distance.
And the grandchild isn't fundamentally responsible for the survivor's immediate emotional regulation. They have their parents as an emotional safety net.
Generational distance acts as a psychological hazmat suit. The grandchild can hear it as history, deeply personal history, but not an immediate threat to the stability of the living room.
But returning to the second gen, this massive tension between the heroic myth outside and the painful reality inside. Eventually, the dam had to break.
And in Israel, that rupture happened in a highly visible way on the silver screen.
Because cinema is never just entertainment. Movies show us what a society is finally ready to look at. Mayer's research traces this, and analyzing early Israeli cinema reveals exactly how rigid that collective armor was.
From the 1940s to the 1960s, the Holocaust is largely conspicuous by its absence on screen. It perfectly mirrors the living room silence.
But when a survivor was shown, what were the rules?
They were forced into the heroic Zionist narrative. They weren't allowed to exist as complex, traumatized individuals. They had to undergo an initiation.
An initiation to become the new Hebrew.
Precisely. They had to physically and metaphorically shed their diaspora identity, which was coded as weak and passive. The new Hebrew was coded as male, agricultural, morally pure, and aggressively controlling the space.
They'd show them taking off the dusty clothes of the old world and putting on the crisp Israeli identity. It functions exactly like a superhero origin story.
It really does.
You step into the phone booth, a broken refugee, the camera cuts, and you step out Superman, ready to build a nation. It's a fantasy of instantaneous, permanent healing.
A collective fantasy deemed necessary for national survival. But armor cannot adapt. It shatters under pressure. The text identifies two massive shocks that finally shattered the myth of the invincible Israeli.
The first was the trial of Adolf Eichmann in the early 60s.
Right. It was broadcast directly into living rooms. Suddenly, survivors were no longer abstract figures. They were on the witness stand, fiercely telling unvarnished stories to the whole nation.
It forced the collective memory to finally sit down and listen to the private memory.
And the second shock hit a decade later, the Yom Kippur War in 1973.
Which shattered the myth of military invincibility.
The resulting feeling of national vulnerability was a massive psychological shift. Once invincibility was broken on the battlefield, cinema had permission to move away from the rigid, heroic narrative.
The text notes that modern filmmakers, often second or third generation, started actively deconstructing the old Zionist myth.
Looking impartially at this, It's a natural evolution of sociological processing. They refuse to neatly erase the Holocaust and replace it with national redemption.
Because you can't just take off trauma like a dirty shirt. It rewires the nervous system.
Exactly. Modern cinema began to embrace a pluralistic view. Characters were allowed to be messy, flawed, openly vulnerable, without the narrative demanding they instantly become a stoic pioneer.
To truly see this shift, Mara directs us to two highly contrasting films. Both drop second-generation members directly back onto the physical soil of their trauma. Let's dive into the first one, a 2004 feature called Metallic Blues.
Metallic Blues is a brilliant case study because it operates on a comic, tragic frequency. It takes the confident Israeli identity and forces a violent collision with unresolved past trauma.
The premise sounds like a buddy comedy. You have two car dealers, Shmuel, son of survivors, and his assistant Ciso. They get a vintage luxury car and drive it to Germany to sell it. You expect a light-hearted road trip movie.
And that genre choice is deliberate. The director lulls the audience into a false sense of security before completely dismantling the protagonist's psyche.
And the real genius, according to Maurer, is the psychological consequence of geographic displacement. What happens when these confident guys leave home turf?
When they are physically disconnected from Israeli soil, the protective armor of the new Hebrew vanishes instantly. Without geographical validation, their egos are exposed as incredibly fragile.
They aren't confident Sabras anymore. They're vulnerable strangers in a haunted land.
Shmuel experiences this intense psychological blur. He's in modern Germany, but he mentally cannot separate it from Nazi Germany.
Maurer points out that the Nazi terrifying Shmuel isn't even an accurate historical memory because Shmuel wasn't there.
His internalized image is colored entirely by Hollywood stereotypes. The leather-clad Gestapo officer, the cartoonish camp guard.
Imagine the cognitive load of that. You're trying to buy a cup of coffee, but your brain automatically overlays a Hollywood villain onto the barista's face. The psychological static is deafening.
It leads to a massive mental breakdown, which serves as a breakthrough. The difference between Metallic Blues and earlier films is location. It forces the confrontation directly on German soil. It strips the geographical safety net.
So how does a movie about failing to sell a car dismantle the tough Sabra myth?
By proving its uselessness against true trauma. Shmuel's tough exterior provides zero protection. He can't punch his way out of inherited trauma or out-negotiate his ghosts.
It argues that true identity requires facing the terrifying vulnerability the Sabra myth tried to pave over.
And Maurer emphasizes this film as a pedagogical tool. Educators can pause a scene where Shmuel hallucinates Hollywood Nazis and ask students to examine their own inherited stereotypes.
It lets teenagers see the cracks in the national armor through an accessible medium.
Exactly. Now, Metallic Blues uses fiction. The second film, Mao analyzes, flips the script completely. It abandons fiction for raw documentary.
It features a father trying to force that exact same geographic confrontation onto his reluctant kids.
Right. We're moving to the raw, unscripted reality of Pizza in Auschwitz, released in 2008.
Just sit with that title. Pizza in Auschwitz, it feels jarring. Almost offensive.
Which is exactly the point of the defense mechanism it highlights.
Yeah.
The documentary follows Danny Chenock, an actual Auschwitz survivor who has a burning obsession to return to the sites of his suffering.
But he refuses to go alone. He forces his adult children to go with him.
And the agonizing conflict is, his children do not want to go at all.
Because they've suffered a massive Holocaust overdose their entire lives.
If we recall the two types of homes, silence versus overdose, Danny's was firmly the latter.
These kids had the graphic horrors served at breakfast every morning. Their emotional capacity is full. They desperately want distance from the trauma haunting their dad.
But Danny's psychological defense mechanisms compel him to push forward. He relies heavily on normalization and incredibly dark humor.
Trying to synthesize private horror with collective meaning.
But his daughter, Miri, pushes back fiercely. It's a clash of strong personalities driven by opposing needs. The father needs to remember. The daughter needs to rest.
And the thematic representation is key. Mir offers a profound breakdown of what Danny and Miri represent sociologically.
According to the text, Danny represents the failed attempt to embody the ultimate Sabra. He tried to synthesize his trauma into a tough, humorous, forward-moving Israeli persona, but the cracks are glaring.
I have to push back on the text there. Is Danny really a failed attempt, or was the Sabra ideal just an impossible, totally unfair standard to hold a survivor to?
Oh, absolutely.
You survive Auschwitz, and society expects you to step off the boat and be an unbothered farmer who never cries. The failure is the lack of empathy in the myth itself.
That's highly perceptive reading, and aligns with the postmodern deconstruction we discussed. Danny couldn't fit the mold without fracturing, but contrast him with his daughter, Miri.
What does she represent on screen?
Miri represents the postmodern alternative.
Yeah.
A rejection of the rigid Israeli mold her father tried to force. She openly refuses to march to the trauma drum. She demands the right to a private, unburdened life.
And the director makes a deliberate choice here. The film is framed almost entirely through Miri's exhausted perspective, not her father's memorializing perspective.
It's a massive paradigm shift, a complete inversion of the cinematic hierarchy. The camera sides with the daughter screaming, "Enough!" rather than the father demanding, "Remember."
It's a 180-degree turn from early Zionist films.
And it proves that too much talking, too much graphic exposure, can be just as paralyzing as total silence. The journey doesn't end with neat closure. It ends by exposing the raw nerves of intergenerational friction.
Both films use the journey to Europe to force a cognitive shift. But how does this help us understand the bigger picture today? Because we are facing a stark reality where the first generation actual witnesses like Danny are rapidly fading away.
Which brings us to the most urgent section of Mayer's document. He explores the anxiety surrounding the remaining time, or Hasman Shenotar.
The ticking clock is getting louder.
As survivors pass away, the driving anxiety in Holocaust discourse is who will bear the authentic testimony. How do you preserve visceral memory without the physical memory holder?
Mayer uses two poignant quotes to illustrate this. First, Yitzhak Artzi, a survivor imagining his funeral. He envisions his family leaving him in the grave and says, "They will leave me abandoned and alone."
It's devastating. It's the existential fear of being left alone in the dark of history, that the truth ends at the grave.
But then Mayer contrasts this with a quote from Yitzhak's son, Shlomo Artzi, who wrote a song about flying to Romania. The lyrics say, "A stolen night flight to Romania. Why does that fear suddenly attack me? How much time do we have left together?"
You can hear the exact moment the mantle passes. Shlomo realizes time is running out. He must make the physical journey and internalize the point of lack before the source of it is gone forever.
And this is where the narrative structure of the journey becomes a vital pedagogical tool. The journey breaks down the traveler's existing identity and rebuilds it.
You leave the airport on Tuesday, and a week later you land back home, but your internal space is permanently altered.
Altered by the meeting with the other. Standing on the actual dirt of the trauma rearranges your psychological furniture.
Which is why Mayer argues that teachers taking youth delegations to Poland shouldn't just hand teens a dry history book. They must utilize these cinematic texts.
Cinema is an unparalleled tool for empathy.
It gives teenagers a framework to process intergenerational trauma. It helps them understand defense mechanisms, why a survivor uses dark humor, or why a grandparent shuts down.
It provides a safe space for youth to navigate their private identity against the national collective memory.
If we synthesize everything, a profound realization emerges. The transition from the invincible Sabra myth to the messy, vulnerable narrative in modern film actually saves the memory from fading.
How does vulnerability save the memory?
By taking the survivor off the impossible superhero pedestal and allowing them to be flawed, traumatized humans, it makes the Holocaust human again.
It stops being a marble monument and becomes a relatable human tragedy for the third and fourth generations.
The rigid Sabra armor would have eventually rusted out.
Yeah.
The newer generations couldn't relate to unyielding stoicism. The truth endures because it is recognized as human.
And to you, listening to this deep dive, this highlights the incredible power of cinema. When you watch these films, you're engaging in a simulated psychological journey.
The camera gives you the lens to see the phantom limb that still dictates how a society walks. It provides emotional vocabulary for trauma that defies language.
We've covered a massive expanse today. We started in the hushed, anxious living rooms of the second generation, traced how Israel built an unyielding armor to survive, pushing private trauma away.
And watched that armor crack onto the screen in metallic blues and pizza in Auschwitz.
But as we wrap up Moore's research, we have to return to the point of lack. The void that generates the energy for the journey. Looking toward the future raises an important question.
When the first generation completely passes away and the third and fourth generations assume the mantle, what happens to the point of lack?
Yeah.
When there is no living parent to demand the journey, will the physical trip to Poland devolve into just another historical tour? Or will the trauma metabolize into an unseen form of Israeli identity? How will filmmakers in 20 years reflect a memory that has no living witnesses left to correct the script?
That is a profound question to chew on. We started by talking about the Sabra identity as constructed armor. For decades, the collective memory pretended the bone wasn't broken as long as the shiny armor held up.
But you cannot heal what you refuse to look at.
Exactly. The journey, whether physically stepping onto a plane to Poland or looking through the unflinching lens of a camera, is the only way to finally take the heavy armor off and treat the profound ache of that phantom limb. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking the hard questions, keep looking past the armor, and we'll see you next time.